Just saying no to drugs is getting harder as Mexico's drug cartels battle for the lucrative U.S. market. Is Mexico the only country to blame for the surge in drugs and violence? Or is it a matter of supply and demand? Next on Global Pulse. A comparison of how broadcasters worldwide are covering the war on drugs. It's been a bloody year near the U.S. and Mexico border as the war on drugs intensifies. While CNN's Lou Dobbs pushes viewers to fear the violence heading north, NBC News sets the scene from the U.S. point of view.
In a fierce battle between the Mexican government and heavily armed drug traffickers, more than 4,000 people have been killed in the last year and a half, including some 500 police and soldiers. Officials say huge portions of Mexico are controlled by 4 drug cartels, smuggling tons of cocaine, marijuana, methamphetamine, and heroin throughout the U.S. Mexican officials insist they are gaining ground, but at a horrible price.
Mexico's drug wars are now a grave threat to this country and to American citizens.
Phoenix police continue to investigate an incident last month where at least 6 heavily armed men dressed in SWAT-style body armor killed a man, firing more than 100 rounds at this suburban house. Police call it a cartel drug hit. From local police to the Border Patrol, law enforcement officials are warning their officers to be prepared for heavily armed cartel operatives on U.S. soil.
So how did these heavily armed cartel operatives get so heavily armed? The BBC followed the trail directly to the U.S.
This was Tijuana recently, a city that borders the United States. Police and troops are taking on members of a drug cartel. Nearby, school children are rushed to safety. Inside, police find 6 bodies. But whilst most victims are Mexican, 90% of all the cartel's guns now come from the United States.
From the Latinos' point of view, the U.S.'s share of the blame doesn't stop with weapons. As Univision and Galavision show, Mexican President Calderón was quick to point out America's growing appetite for illicit drugs.
President Felipe Calderón declared that drug violence near the border of Mexico and the United States is provoked by America's high demand and consumerism. Calderón stated, "Mexico is not the only one at fault, and we can't resolve it on our own." He said the addicts are over there in the U.S., and the dead are over here in Mexico.
The President of Mexico, Felipe Calderón, launched a new critique against the United States government, so far making it the second one in less than 2 weeks.
It's absurd to believe that the connections between criminals only exist in Mexico. And once the drugs cross over the border, all affiliations with criminals and drug connections disappear, as if they've never existed.
At first, there was sweeping public support for President Calderón's crackdown on the drug cartels. But as Al Jazeera English shows, now many are beginning to question the army's tactics and the extreme violence.
There are increasing complaints of human rights violations by soldiers who force confessions from detainees. Some observers say it's starting to look like a war with no end. The vast majority of the dead are members of rival drug organizations battling in the streets, but an increasing number of recent victims are innocent children caught in the crossfire. But as the president's crackdown prevents some drugs from entering the United States, many narcotics are staying in Mexico. That's producing more addicts and further stressing the country's already strained law enforcement agencies.
And addiction may actually be at the heart of the problem. While most U.S. news shy away from showing American addicts, Venezuela's Telesur explores the drug cartel's #1 customer, the U.S.
Drug addiction is a problem that affects more than 14 million people living in the U.S. This problem, which the government recognizes as seriously challenging, has many repercussions. The dilemma worsens as the supply elevates the demand. Or is it the demand that increases the supply? Data released by the UN indicates that despite a worldwide plateau in drug usage, the supply has increased. The United States, one of the countries with the highest consumption of drugs in the world, prefers to fight the problem where drugs are produced. And while it invests over $60 billion in the so-called war on drugs, it only invests $8 billion in treatment and prevention.
For Global Pulse, this is Erin Coker.
This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Link TV is the only US network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs which connect you to the world.